So let's start with this first session on East Asian approaches to economic security. So we have a fantastic lineup of speakers to cover this huge topic, all coming from different parts of East Asia. And the whole point will be to try to better understand what is the approach taken by each of these various countries on this economic security issue. So I will briefly introduce them without giving their full bios. That would be too long and too complicated. So let's start perhaps with the people online. So thanks for being with us online. It's too bad. We'd rather have you in person, but unfortunately that was not possible. But we had Pavida not long ago. So all right. So the first speaker, or well, maybe not in the order that he will be speaking. The first is Kazuto Suzuki. Virtually, he is a director and group head of economic security at the Institute of Geoeconomics, International House of Japan. So he will be covering Japan. Then next to me to my right is Professor Seungjoo Lee. He is professor of political science and international relations at Chung-Ang University in Seoul. To my left is Henry Gao, professor of law at Singapore Management University, who will take care of China. Then to my far left is Kristy Tsun-Tzu, excuse my Chinese, who is director at the Taiwan ASEAN Studies Center at Chung-Hua Institution of Economic Research, which is one of the most famous economics research institutions in Taiwan. And last but not least is Pavida, PANANOND, professor at Thammasat University. And Pavida will cover Thailand. Pavida is in a slightly different position compared to the others, because my understanding, but well, you may say differently, Thailand is rather reacting to the other countries' economic security strategies than having its own economic security strategy. That's the way I see things, but Pavida, you feel free to disagree with me and say differently. Okay, so these are our speakers, and let me perhaps start with Kazuto Suzuki. The reason for giving the floor to Japan first is that I think that Japan was the first country to actually draft an economic security strategy, and Japan even went as far as creating a special ministry for that. So Japan has an economic security ministry now in place. It's been in place for a couple of years. It was created in 2021, if I understand properly. So let's give the floor to Japan first, and then we'll move on to perhaps Korea, then China, then Taiwan, and finally Thailand. So Professor Suzuki, the floor is yours to explain what is economic security as seen from a Japanese perspective. We'll stick perhaps in the first round to the definition or the perception of economic security, and we'll move on perhaps in the second round to the policies per se. Okay, so Professor Suzuki, floor is yours for 7 minutes or so, 7 to 10 maximum. But keep in mind that we'll maybe turning to policies and actions a little bit later on. Okay, so floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Professor Nicola, and thank you very much for inviting me. I am currently in Haneda Airport. I just came back from United States, so I'm sorry that I can't be with you, but because of this hectic international travel is making me impossible to go to Paris. So yes, I think you're right, but unfortunately the timing is a little different. The Economic Security Promotion Act is established in 2022, May 2022. And we don't have a ministry dedicated to the economic security, but a minister dedicated, well, in charge of the economic security. So why do we have this? perhaps if we round up in a historical sense, I think the 2010 incident that China has stopped exporting the rare earth mineral to Japan as a result of the incident that took place in territory Senkaku Island, which is a disputed territory in Japan, between Japan and China. And this was the first case that China is using an economic coercion to Japan. And ever since, there is a very clear understanding that the economy is no longer isolated from the political context, but economy is integrated in the political context and used as a weapon. So weaponization of international trade is being fairly, recognized fairly early in this whole context. And there are many other instances that China has stopped the imports from, let's say, coal and wine from Australia, the stopping imports from salmon from Norway. There are a variety of things that took place that China is using the economic coercion as the method of imposing a certain policy objective. And we clearly recognize that this is the case, or this is the name of the game today. So I think the previous opening session, there are discussion about incentives. And I think this is perhaps the most important and interesting, unique point of Japan is that it's not the monetary incentives that is given and move the Japanese companies to follow the Japanese economic security strategy, but it is the dialogue to share the same understanding of the threats that is imposed by China. So basically, the idea is that we need to have a lengthy discussion to clarify what are the interests of businesses and what are the security interests for the Japanese government. So the concept of small yard high fence that means a lot to Japan. There is a clear distinction. So Economic Security Promotion Act, which was established last year, is defining what are the strategically important commodities, for example, the rare earths, semiconductor, etc., and then negotiate with the companies that what are the thresholds of things that needs to be controlled and which are vulnerable to Japan, and to make sure that the rest of the transactions are open to free trade. So it's a combination and the juggling between the concept of free trade and maintaining the economic security. So one of the example is that when the United States has decided to strengthen the export control of the semiconductor to China in last October 2022, and but ever since the United States has put a demand or pressure on Japan to follow the American system, because the Japanese manufacturing equipment are basically out of the re-export control. So United States has demanded the Japanese government to set up the sort of a similar export control regime, but Japan took about more than 6 months to negotiate with an industry to say which are the most sensitive products of the companies, and to make sure that the controlled items are limited, and the rest, the machines which are using for the legacy chips are basically open for the free trade. So this sort of a separation of the controlling items and the free trade items is the way in which that Japan is trying to adhere the idea of the rule-based international order. So we respect the international rules of free trade, Japan is a leading company of the CPTPP, and also Japan is following the rules of the WTO. So economic security is not the panacea, or is not an excuse for breaking all the rules. We are trying to make, to limit the level of the control, to make sure that, we are not being vulnerable for the economic coercion. And that's the major issues, and that's the major objective. And finally, I like to add that Japan is also thinking of the economic strategic indispensability. So this is another unique aspect of Japan, try to be indispensable in the network of the supply chain. So investing in the science and technology and emerging technology in particular is extremely important for Japan, to make sure that we become indispensable in the supply chain, so that we'll have a leverage against the other countries' coercion. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for explaining how Japan is reconciling both free trade and the respect of the rules-based order and protection to some extent, but very, very limited one. But perhaps can you elaborate slightly more or a little bit longer on the strategic indispensability idea? I'm not too sure I got it fully.
Well, the strategic indispensability, the strategic autonomy is to reduce the dependency on others and to reduce the vulnerability. But strategic indispensability is it's a more proactive economic security, so that we'll develop our technology, the technical expertise, and particularly the items which are in the sort of upstream of the production site. For example, the material, the manufacturing equipment, or the machine tools. These are the kind of things that is relatively monopolized in the global supply chain. And if we become as indispensable country, then if we receive, or if some countries, particularly China, putting a pressure, economic pressure on this, then we'll have tools to retaliate for the countries which are coercing us. So that will be, let's say, in some sort of a deterrence mechanism to make sure that we'll have enough capabilities and resources to counterbalance the economic coercion. So that's the concept of the indispensability.
Okay, thank you. So you create leverage, actually.
Yeah.
You do your best so as to create leverage. Okay, well, thanks a lot for this the explanation of the Japanese perspective on economic security. Let me now turn to Korea. I don't want to sound nasty, but my impression is that the Korean strategy is not as clear-cut as the Japanese one, but maybe I'm being negative. So prove me wrong.
Yeah, used to be, because of course there are some policy legacies. Well, inertia, what I would like to talk about the defining nature of South Korea's economic strategy in the following 4 areas. First one is that actually one of the defining features of South Korea's economic strategy is reactive. Actually, for the last several years, South Korea suffered a lot from economic coercion great powers from actually many countries, such as China, Japan, and even to some extent, the United States. As is well known, South Korea suffered a lot from China's economic coercion in the wake of the South Korea's decision to deploy THAAD. And then the impact of that economic coercion was kind of devastating to the Korean economy. And also 2019, actually, the Japanese government decided to drop South Korea from its white list. And then actually economic coercion or export control of the Japanese government concentrated on the parts and materials that are essential to the production of South Korea's key export items, such as semiconductor. And it was, again, huge impact and to the South Korean economy. And the third is that actually upon inauguration of the Trump president, actually the U.S. government took a kind of the unilateral as well as mercantilist nature in dealing with South Korea. Actually, in 2019, the U.S. government announced that it would withdraw from the TPP and then embarked on to revising the Chorus FTA and also try to substantially change the terms of the defense burden sharing with the South Korean government. That, of course, that was not a classic case of the economic coercion, but to many of the South Korean experts and policymakers, it was conceived as a U.S. mercantilist nature of the economic security strategy, even in dealing with the U.S. allies and partners. So having experienced such an economic coercion or near economic coercion from the great powers, South Korean government tries to come up with a reactive economic security strategy in dealing with those economic coercions. But another thing I would like to highlight is that although South Korea suffered a lot from the economic coercion, actually, thus far, South Korean government has not come up with a systematic counter-coercive measures. That is another feature of the South Korea's economic strategy. South Korea tries to absorb the impact of the economic coercion within the South Korean economy rather than directly imposing economic coercion onto other countries. And another feature is that actually South Korea, on the one hand, clearly perceived that there has been a limit in pursuing the reactive nature of the economic security strategy. In that regard, South Korea's economic security strategy, on the other hand, has been in transition for the last couple of years, particularly after the inauguration of the current Yoon Suk-yeol government. And the current government tries to add some kind of proactive element of the economic security strategy, particularly given that it is gonna be almost impossible, practically impossible, to deal with the strategic dilemma arising from the U.S.-China strategic competition. It has to be proactive rather than reactive in dealing with those strategic challenges. And another last point I would like to highlight is that South Korea's emphasis on reducing structural vulnerabilities is another central feature of the South Korea's economic security strategy. In addition to the strategic dilemma, as I outlined, actually South Korea is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world in terms of the import vulnerability. Actually, there has been a survey of 80 countries. Actually, South Korea's import vulnerability was one of the highest in the world. And perceiving that kind of a vulnerable nature of the South Korea's economy, Korean government has tried to complement and remedy those vulnerabilities in a proactive measure. So in that regard, I would say South Korea's current economic security strategy has been in clear transition away from reactive to a more proactive posture. Yeah, let me stop there.
Yeah, thank you to Professor Lee. So one interesting thing that you said, I was attending a conference yesterday with Koreans, and about this economic security aspect. One person made the point that there was an before THAAD and after THAAD. So it was really a watershed moment. But from what you say, it's not only about THAAD. And THAAD was one episode of economic coercion that South Korea was a victim of. But there are other episodes of economic coercion coming from Japan, from the US. So it's more complicated than that. It's not exclusively about THAAD.
And multifaceted.
Yeah, and multifaceted. Okay, so it's good. Well, good to hear that there is this shift away from being reactive, exclusively reactive, to being more proactive. But perhaps on the vulnerability dimension, can you again expand a little bit on the? In what respect is South Korea vulnerable? I mean, what do you mean by vulnerability? Well, I guess I have some idea, but
yeah. Actually, the sources of South Korea's vulnerability has to do with its reliance on the key materials and parts and equipment. actually that are essential to the production of the South Korea's major industries, such as semiconductor batteries and et cetera. So actually, South Korean major companies heavily rely on the importation of those items. So for the last couple of years, the Korean government tried to substantially strengthen and like a self-sufficiency in these areas, like together with actually there has been a close coordination among the Ministry of Science and ICT and the Ministry of Industry, Trade and Energy. So that is the one I would say the one of the like a defining feature of the South Korea's economic security strategy.
Okay, thank you. I guess we come back to that on how to reduce vulnerability.
Yeah.
I have some cases in mind, some examples.
Well, I can tell you now.
Yeah, no, well, we'll discuss that later, perhaps. Let's now move on to
Thank you, Françoise. It's my pleasure to be back to Ifri after many years to attend this conference. So China's view on economic security could only be understood if we understand what is the Chinese view on what is economic and what is security. So let me start with the economic part. And this basically relates to the question as to what kind of economy China wants. Recently, I published a new book with Cambridge University Press, which is titled Between Market Economy and State Capitalism, China's SOEs and the World Trading System. In this book, I basically provided a comprehensive overview of China's SOE reform for the past 45 years, from 1978 until today. And I look at the trajectory of the development so far, and what I concluded was that for the first 25 years of this reform, you see China was really trying to move towards a market economy. But then for the last 20 years, you see China basically moving back towards what the Chinese would call socialist market economy. So what is this concept of a socialist market economy? This sounds like an oxymoron because classical socialism would demand planned economy, while market economy is traditionally regarded as associated with capitalism. So this is China's effort to try to blend a kind of limited liberalization in the economic sector while maintaining the control of the Communist Party. Now, even if they are calling this a socialist market economy, if they can keep the market economy part, that would still be good. But recently, things started to change, especially in the past 10 years. And this was made most evident when President Xi gave his speech, or should I say General Secretary Xi, because he gave the speech in his capacity as the General Secretary of the CCP at the 20th Party Congress last year. And I, in an op-ed with the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CG, where I serve as a senior fellow that I published in March this year, I kind of deciphered the message, the hidden message he had in his speech. And my conclusion is that he indicated in his speech, he didn't state it explicitly, but he indicated that he's moving towards a Soviet-style economic policy. Basically, you would have the Soviet-style industrialization plan that is focusing very much on heavy industry development. So that is the future direction that China is moving towards to. And this is really worrying. And if he achieves what he wants, we would have a very different economic policy in China as we have seen over the past 45 years. The second issue is what is security. Now, earlier, Professor Suzuki actually mentioned the Japanese view of national security. And as Françoise mentioned, actually Japan is a leader in that regard because they are the first one to have a minister of economic security. But I would add that actually, if you look at which country has the highest level of institutions devoted to national security, that is probably China. Because China has been talking about establishing a kind of a US-style National Security Commission since the late 90s. And this took many years, and finally, the new National Security Commission was established in 2014 and held its first meeting in that year. And guess who was the head of this commission? Nobody other than President Xi himself. So he personally headed the commission, and he also headed this small leading group on national security, very high level. So at the first meeting of the National Security Commission in 2014, he unveiled this so-called holistic review of national security. And this is really something interesting because it outlined a total of 20 major areas where national security is concerned. Now, let me read to you the full list. Political security, military security, homeland security, economic security, financial security, cultural security, public security, science and technology security, cyber security, food security, ecological security, resource security, nuclear security, overseas interest security, and outer space security, deep sea security, polar security, biosecurity, artificial intelligence security, and finally, data security. Wow, that is really a mouthful, right? I couldn't remember all of this, so every time I had to read from the list. But as you can see, this reflects the paranoia of the CCP and the Chinese government in a few critical areas where they failed the threat. So this is also reflected in the so-called choking neck issues that the Chinese government kept referring to. And the Chinese government actually identified a total of 35 choking neck issues. So these all relates to the key technology areas where China is lagging behind, where, like Professor Lee mentioned, the crucial technology is held by foreign countries. So at the top of the list, you have a semiconductor, okay? And these include also semiconductor manufacturing technologies such as lithography, and also the space technology, and also the precision manufacturing technologies, and so on. So with this kind of approach on national security, I guess you could understand a bit why China is taking all these different ways to try to solve the problem, such as economic coercion on other countries, including Korea, and also the plan to take Taiwan by force, right? So all these are related, but in the interest of time, I think I will leave the issue of how China to plan to solve the economic security issue maybe to the second segment of the panel. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Gao, for this very clear explanation and reading the long list. So thank you. Now let's now move on to Taiwan with Dr. Su.
Yes. First of all, thank Ifri for inviting me here for this very important, timely issue. Actually, when we were in Taipei, all delegations coming to Taipei were asked exactly the same question, the silicon shields and all these kind of questions. So in Taiwan, we do not have a long list of national security issues, but because Taiwan is a very small, dynamic, open economy and very much dependent on international trade. So our concept of national security or national security is actually evolving according to our external economic and political landscape. For example, 20 years ago, we talked about too much concentration in the U.S. market, and also the U.S. trade remedy measures. And 10, 15 years ago, we talked that we should not lag behind any other countries in exploring Chinese market. But right now, in the past 5 years, we talk more about Chinese coercion, too much concentration or dependence in Chinese market, And also, we still have problems or difficulty trying to access international networks. For example, we have problem trying to develop more FTAs, including the CPTPP, and also we are not invited to IPEF, etc. So we know to have a lot more economic security concerns where our deputy minister has already explained some points of them. So coming to 2 points that the government as well as the business sector have been working so hard in the past 5 years is about this rebalancing and diversifying our markets as well as supply chain partnership. Yes, 10 years ago, we for every $100 we invested in overseas country, $85 would go to Chinese. However, in the past 3 years, only 30% or $30 would go to Chinese market, while the other $17 will go to Southeast Asian countries, India, as well as United States. So that means that we are becoming more rebalancing and much more diversification in terms of responding to international collaboration to diversify our supply chain. And second, that is about the TSMC and also or the semiconductor supply chain. And we really did not realize that Taiwan was so much highlighted after the world began realized how serious shortage of chips became. And therefore, semiconductor has been in the attention of this international security discussion for the past years, and very different from other sectors that Taiwanese companies have been outsourcing to every part of the world: textile and garment, footwear, food processing, also electronics and ICT. Semiconductor has been very much rooted in Taiwan because we are the only place that could provide a complete ecosystem. So for TSMC and also other chip makers, they are now stepping out from Taiwan to other countries. They are facing some fundamental issues. For example, the plant now being constructed in Arizona in the U.S., there are the labor issue, for example, and also they have difficulty, the recruitment difficulty issue. Then also, even if TSMC is going to mass produce advanced chips 2 years later from now, there's still no advanced testing and packaging capacity in the U.S. And that will make the U.S. Resilience or strategy a big hole. And therefore, it depends on all these countries to develop a complete supply chain, not only by Taiwan, but also by their local government, as well as by Taiwan's partners in this country. So the U.S. Investment project now is facing a lot of challenges. And while our investment in Japan is going much more smoothly, because in Japan, they do have supply chains already. They have test and packaging capacity. And also the government is providing a lot more generous subsidies. And also TSMC in Japan is collaborating with local partners, but they are working on their own, 100% TSMC-owned operation in the U.S., but it's a joint venture in Japan, and it's going to be a joint venture in Dresden, Germany. So we think that this kind of collaboration will be much more important for TSMC and other chip makers from Taiwan to have more successful and more smooth operations in this country. And we don't think that by investing in other countries that will weaken TSMC or Taiwan's role in semiconductor, because currently we produce more than 92% of our total chips, including mature chips as well as advanced chips in Taiwan. Only less than 8% of chips are now produced outside Taiwan. Some 3% in Southeast Asia, around 4% in China, and they are all mature chips. So Taiwan will maintain its role, as even TSMC is going to have more footprints in other countries. So I think I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, Dr. Su already anticipated a little bit about the policies. So let me go back. I'll give the floor. Pavida, I'll give you the floor later on, perhaps, unless you really want to jump in. But I think that Thailand's position being slightly different, I'll give you the floor later on, unless you really want to say something. Okay?
No.
So let's go back to Dr. Suzuki about the policies, the concrete actions that Japan is taking. Professor Suzuki, are you still there, or are you having lunch at the lounge? Oh,
It is indeed.
Yeah, I am, but
oh, you are. Okay.
yeah. So
Sorry for that. That was a bad joke.
I
Okay.
think I'm having a sort of a connection problem.
No, that's fine. You're back with us. We see you at least,
Oh yes, I am.
and we hear you.
Yeah.
Okay. Great.
Okay. So what was the question? I couldn't hear you because of the connection problem.
Sorry for that. Yeah, well, you gave us the definition of economic security, and now I'm asking about the concrete policy actions that are put in place by Japan to implement this
Right.
economic security.
Right. So the major achievement has already done in the semiconductor sector. Japan has a significant amount of investment for the inviting the TSMC to Kumamoto, and also we are establishing the new semiconductor company called Rapidus to make sure that we'll be able to catch up with the industrial level at the very high end of the producing semiconductors. So this is not only the economic security per se, but it is also the policies towards the to elevating the Japanese industrial level in the semiconductor industry. The other concrete policies that we are now taking place is to secure the protection of the infrastructure. Because the infrastructure, particularly I think 5G is a good example to, if you leave the procurement of the infrastructure network is let the market, if you leave it to the market, then people are just buying. The operators are procuring from the cheapest cheapest providers. So what happens is that the Japanese Economic Security Promotion Act is defining that the 14 different infrastructure sector, and make sure that if they are procuring the from foreign sources, then it needs to report, and if they fail to report, then it will be considered as a violation of the law. So Japanese government will do a much more investigation on these procurement contracts, not only the hardware but also the services like maintenance and the other software services. The other concrete example, well, which is not yet concrete, but now we are in the discussion of the security clearance issues. The security clearance is the way in which that Japan is trying to limit the people who can access to the state secret, but also trying to protect the leaks of the technologies that is not that is to maintain our indispensability. And also this is the concept of security clearance is the way in which that the Japan can work with the foreign companies. And I think one of the harbinger is that yesterday there was a conclusion of the contract with the procurement by the Australian forces with the Japanese electric company Mitsubishi Electric. So this is another way in which that the Japan is trying to enhance its economic capabilities while trying to protect its technical superiority for the sake of the indispensability. So I can go on, but I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Mr. Suzuki. So, Dr. Lee, some concrete actions on the part of Korea?
Yeah, the bottom line in terms of South Korea's economic security strategy is that the Korean government does not rely on one specific policy. Actually, rather, Korean government is much more interested in pursuing various policies simultaneously. So, such as the diversification and reshoring, and the increase tax efficiency or tax sovereignty, as well as the industrial policy and also international cooperation. So, Korean government has made a lot of efforts in combining those different policy areas. So that is, I think, the peculiar nature of the South Korean government's economic security strategy. Having said that, in terms of diversification policy, actually, Korean government in collaboration with the private companies has promoted the idea of the China plus Alpha strategy. Okay. Actually, there has been a gradual transformation in terms of the diversification policy away from China into some Southeast Asian countries, such as Vietnam. Actually, this point was raised up in the opening sessions, right? So Samsung is the classic and the typical case of the diversification in terms of the supply chain strategy. But one thing I have to say or emphasize is that diversification away from China into Southeast Asia does not necessarily mean that South Korean companies will abandon China as a market. China as a market is still important. So that's one of the reasons why Korean government tries to ensure the market access to China simultaneously. Another thing is that the South Korean government has been very active in promoting reshoring policy as well. Of course, the track record of the reshoring policy for the last several years has not been very much impressive, particularly compared to the diversification policy. But here, sign is clear. Actually, I would say almost 80% of the companies returning to Korea is from China. So that clearly shows the South Korea's reshoring policy's nature. At the same time, South Korea also tries to combine the tax sovereignty as well as the industrial policy. As I indicated in the first remarks, actually, South Korean government has made a lot of efforts to increase or enhance its own technological self-sufficiency, particularly in the areas of parts, elements, parts, materials, and equipment. So that's why, dating back to the 2020, South Korean government designated so-called 100 key national technologies in the areas of materials, parts, and equipment. And then last year, the current Yoon government expanded that list to include 150 technologies. And together with that policy, South Korean government also designated 10 national strategic technologies. And those are the kind of attempts made by the Korean government to strengthen the South Korea's tech sovereignty. But at the same time, in terms of the industrial policy, South Korean government recently announced that it would create the world's largest semiconductor cluster in Yongin area in Korea. That is the one attempt made by the Korean government to attract foreign capitals and the foreign technologies into South Korea. And that would be the kind of dramatic turnaround in terms of the South Korea's technology policy. Point here is that, again, South Korean government tries to promote industrial policy together with the technology policy as well. Again, the simultaneous pursuit of various policies. That is the essence of the South Korea's economic strategy at this stage.
Well, thank you. I have a couple of questions about technology, but we'll get back to this later. So, Dr. Gao, concrete actions also?
Sure. Before I discuss the concrete actions, maybe I will first discuss between economic and security, which one is more important for China. President Xi made this speech at the first meeting of the 12th National People's Congress earlier this year, where he made a famous statement by saying, 安全是发展的基础. The security is the foundation for development or economic development. So this clearly shows that China clearly places security ahead of economic development. And here, the security, if you think about security, even though China calls it a national security, I would really call it regime security because it mainly relates to the stability of the CCP regime. And that also explains many of the cases of economic coercion. For example, why China had this sanction against Korea because of Assad. That is because it is perceived as a threat to the CCP. Similarly, why China started to block imports of wine and coal from Australia when Australia tried to start an investigation on the origin of the COVID. Again, that is because it is perceived to endanger the security of the CCP. So that, in a way, also explains the policies that China has taken to solve the economic security issue. As you can see here, here again, the concern is not exactly that China wants to provide sufficient space for the private firms to grow. Instead, it is to provide space for the sectors or the type of enterprises, especially the SOEs that China prefer to grow. So in the abstract, there could be three ways to solve the economic security problem for China. And the first one, I call it the Soviet model. That is the model of indigenous innovation, where, if you recall, during the Cold War, because of the confrontation between the US and the Soviet Union, the Soviets had no choice but to do everything on their own. So China has been trying this indigenous innovation route for many years, with the famous Made in China 2025, as the most well-known example. But the result has been less than successful. And this is actually illustrated, if you read the news last year, by the failure of the so-called semiconductor super fund, right? Where China set up this super fund to promote the development in the semiconductor industry. But what happened was that it was plagued by a series of very big corruption scandals, to the extent that the managers of the super fund were arrested, and even the minister of the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology was also arrested, because of all this corruption scandal. So that is not surprising, because in the current environment in China, to really spend a lot of effort and time and money on semiconductor development is perceived to be very foolish, because the current Chinese market is a market where everyone wants to make some quick money, especially in the real estate development sector, up until around last year when the Chinese real estate market started to crash. So that explains why they were not able to succeed through the indigenous innovation route. The second route is what I would call the Singapore route. So that is to achieve security through diversification. If you look at food security, for example, which country is the most food secure in Southeast Asia? It is Singapore, a country that does not produce a single grain of wheat or rice of its own. That is because Singapore has friends all over the world, and they diversify their source of import. So in addition to importing from the traditional sources, they always exploit additional sources of import. For example, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a news that Singapore started to import eggs from as far away as Poland. Okay, why? Because Singapore is concerned that some of its neighboring countries are going to turn hostile against Singapore, so it has to start, explore non-traditional sources. In a way, you could regard China's Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI, as a way for China to diversify. Is both is export market and also in some cases is import market as a way to solve the economic security issue. But the problem with the BRI is that most of the countries in the BRI have their own problems to start with, which explains why there was very little trade between China and these countries to start with. And even though the BRI is now 10 years old, but as we can see, it is not really successful. You know, this is shown, for example, by the recently held BRI forum in China, you know, where you can see that the number of countries attending the forum kept shrinking, right? Compare the current one is the third one. If you compare with the second one and the first one, you see the numbers kept declining. So again, this diversification strategy is not working. So that leads to the third approach, which I call the Iraqis approach. Some of you might recognize the name Iraqis, right, as the fictional nation in the science fiction novel Dune, right, which produced this really important material called the spice, which is essential for interstellar travel. So Iraqis is basically Taiwan, right? So what has the countries in this science fiction Dune have been doing to take control of spice? By invading the country of Iraqis. So that is basically what China is doing, okay? If you cannot get it through peaceful means, if the US start to block, you know, to have export control, we would just take it by force. And here, China has kind of unveiled its timeline already. The magic year would be 2035. Why? Because if you read the 19th Party Congress report, China has basically made it very clear. They have these so-called 2 centennial goals. The first centennial is the centennial of the establishment of the CCP, so that would be 2021, so where China would achieve a so-called moderately well-off society. The second centennial is the centennial of the establishment of the PRC, that would be 2049. Initially, that was supposed to be the year where China achieved the so-called Chinese-style modernization. But President Xi has pushed forward the target by moving towards 2035, by saying that we would achieve modernization by 2035, and especially military and army modernization, okay? So how could you have a modernized Chinese army without taking back Taiwan, with one piece of China, according to the Chinese government, still missing from the Chinese state? That would not make sense, right? So I would take that, you know, the clock is running. We only have basically 12 years from today that China will be ready to take Taiwan. And if that happens, I cannot imagine. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Tsu, do you want to react to that? I think that's a nice
No, not
segue
to
to you.
Henry's comment, yeah, but I do have some other things to say. As our deputy minister already mentioned, that we are probably the only WTO member that continues to maintain restrictions toward China. So we restricted our FDI. We have foreign investment screening to China, and also we do not allow Chinese companies come to Taiwan, for example, set up R&D center, which is now very, very important. So, and also we definitely do not allow Chinese company to participate in our government procurement project. So having said that, we still found all these existing mechanisms are not enough. And therefore, last year, the government amended the national security law together with the act governing cross-strait relation. For example, for the first time, we put a new clause to punish the so-called economic espionage. And then we extended the penalty for those that committed this crime to at least 12 years in jail. And also we have other things trying to help Taiwanese government receiving funding from the government to protect their either IP or their trade secrets. And one thing I need to emphasize is that we found that Chinese have been been working a lot in the past years because people in Taiwan know nowadays, after all this suffering, that they know how to protect their IP and their trade secret. And therefore, Chinese people now, they shift their strategy. They try to poach our people. They try to poach our senior engineers, our managers, and our key R&D personnel. And therefore, for example, it's reported that up to now, in the past years, China has illegally poached hundreds of thousands of senior engineers, especially those in semiconductor and other technology sector, to work for Chinese company. And therefore, for all this amendment that the government in Taiwan is going to deliver our list of critical core technology to identify this, that we will have special protection. So these are various measures the government have been working a lot. And also in terms of institutional mechanism, I mean, we in Taiwan, we do not have, I mean, we do have Mainland Affairs Council, which is a ministerial level mechanism equal as Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Economic Affairs. And this Mainland Affairs Council has been working significantly in terms of integrating and monitoring our policies and also our policies toward China. So different from other countries that start to look at issues related to China, we've been doing this for 20 years. And now it's always interagency conferences or task force to review everything related to China. So I think that kind of very special mechanism really help government's policy-making process to integrate or to consider the so-called China factor. So when it comes to national security mechanism or institution, we do not have so-called the National Security Ministry or a specialized agency, but we do have this kind of cross-cutting mechanism that has been in operation for more than 2 decades, and which we think is quite helpful. And even though we provide all these restrictions and discrimination to China, and luckily China never raised this to the WTO, so we can continue to have that kind of very unique and very significant, very special trade as well as investment measures against China to protect our national security interests. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, perhaps it's time to give the floor to Pavida, who's been extremely patient. So Pavida, Thailand is among the countries that are the targets of the diversification strategies implemented by a number of countries in East Asia. So what do you have to say about this economic security discussion as seen from a Thai perspective? Oof. So Pavida, the floor is yours. Reactions to everything that's been said before, feel free, and you have plenty of time because you have been extremely patient.
Thank you. Bonjour François et bonjour tout le monde. Thank you once again for inviting me for today. And although it's just online, and I know that it's a heavy issues and a lot of things have been said. But one thing that I would like to take from what you said, Françoise, is that Thailand and perhaps Southeast Asia is in a different position when we look at economic security. So what I would like to do today is to address 4 questions. The first one is I would like to perhaps take a step back and then ask the question of what is economic security? And then the next question is, what is economic security for Southeast Asia and for Thailand? Is economic security the same thing for everyone? And then the third question is, then what to do next for countries that are, as you said, more in the receiving end of not having the choice to choose, but then being the one who are chosen to be part of the economic security team of different superpower. And then the fourth question is the challenge of that kind of strategy. So those would be my 4 issues to cover today. So let's just take a step back and look at what is economic security. And I think before this, the post-pandemic years, when we talk about economic security, we perhaps tend to look at economic security more as a national prosperity. How can countries prosper to make sure that they have their economic future in the world? And I think when we look at the principle and the earlier consensus in the world, open globalization was the kind of the consensus that was the one that people believe that that's would bring economic security. And this is also the belief that many of the smaller economies, particularly those in Southeast Asia and Thailand included, was brought to believe that this is the way to economic security and prosperity by opening up our economy to policies such as the export-led development, and then opening up to trade and investment, inviting companies from different countries to invest in the country and let them export. And this is different from the previous idea of import substitution, as we know very well on that. But that is kind of shifting. And right now, people are looking at the economic security, not so much in terms of how international interdependence can lead to prosperity for everyone. But now the kind of the economic security is more driven by the national interests and more of a national protectionist or national independence, if we are going to use it that way. So that affects the way that we are looking at the economic relationship between countries. We were talking about how different countries can look at investing overseas driven by efficiency, so that their firms can make sure that that is efficient for them and that brings prosperity for the firm and for the country. But now that model, that consensus is being challenged a lot. And we are hearing a lot today from how countries want to protect themselves from being vulnerable to others and being finding leverage to make sure that they are not being coerced by other superpowers. And I think that leads to my second question is, then what is the economic security for countries like Thailand or for Southeast Asia, which have been opening up to this kind of their open globalization? And I think countries that are taking part in this kind of economic globalization more as the supplier, you know, countries like Thailand welcome foreign direct investment from other countries because we play the role of being the manufacturer, being the producer in this game. So the challenge in this kind of changing environment, I think we face twin challenge. First of all, we don't really want to choose side, because both sides have been equally important to the economic development of Southeast Asia and Thailand included. And the second challenge is that we also don't want just to remain as the production hub, because being constrained to just being the manufacturer, what we are facing nowadays is that when countries, lead firms from different countries like TSMC from Taiwan or Samsung from Korea, or American companies or European companies, the first thing that comes to their mind when it comes to economic security is to diversify away or reshoring or coming back nearer to home. And that means that countries that are already part of the global value chain risk being diversified away. And that's one risk that Thailand is facing. And so, especially when the country that has been friendly and open to different partners, and those countries become important. So all the major countries like China, the US, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan are all important to the economic prosperity of Thailand because we have all the firms from those countries investing in our countries. And for Southeast Asian country to choose side, it is also very difficult because on the one hand, China has been very significant in the economic relationship in Asia. If you look at, for example, the intra-regional trade between Asia-Pacific country, you can see that China play the major role. And right now, ASEAN has become the #1 trading partner for China. And it's also the same on the other side. China is the most important trading partner for Southeast Asian countries. And not only for trade, but also for foreign direct investment. But at the same time, the United States remain an important source country for foreign direct investment as well as trade. And so is Japan, who is the country with the highest number of foreign direct investment stock for Southeast Asia and particularly for Thailand. So the challenge of having to choose side when the world becomes less friendly is one security risk for economic security for country like Southeast Asia and for Thailand. So I think that that's the kind of a different risk that we have been talking about. And the second risk is that the risk of being the supplier and the manufacturing hub of those countries. Why is that so? Because when you are the lead firm in the global supply chain, you can choose to take control of your technology, of your R&D and all that. But when you are playing the role of the manufacturer and the producer, you are bounded by two things. You are bounded by your location. They come to you because you are there. And then the second constraint is that you are bound by the kind of the activity that you do in the global supply chain. You are not the one who control where the activities are located. And that is being witnessed in today's world when different country is using industrial policy to attract their firms to reshore or to go to different countries. For example, TSMC has the choice of being in the US, being in Germany, being in Japan, and also being in Taiwan. They have the kind of the industrial policy of those countries to try to attract them to be there. But if you are a country that are the production hub, no one is going to try to lure you from being where you are. So that's the kind of the challenge that being in the production activities, that's what you face as your economic security. So then the next question is what to do for countries that are playing a different role in the global value chain, particularly in the supplier role of the global value chain. And I think Professor Suzuki mentioned earlier about the word you use is indispensable. So how can countries and how can firms be indispensable in their role? And if you look at that term in the international business vocabulary, we might call that sticky. How can you make an investment sticky? How can you make your own role sticky in the global value chain? And I think the choice for Southeast Asia and for perhaps Thailand in particular is how can we stay relevant and sticky in the global and regional value chains? And that I think is the key. And I can see that different policies that could lead to that role to be sticky and be relevant in the supply chains of different industries. First is, of course, to tap into the opportunity that comes from the China +1 strategy. When different firms from different nationalities are trying to find an alternative, a China +1, or you may call it China +X, because now different region is also trying to reshore. And that is the kind of the strategy that I think Thai government and Thailand trying to position as an alternative in Southeast Asia that would make sense for companies and industry that are trying to not to put all their eggs in one basket. But the challenge for that is that we are also competing with countries in the region. Thailand is competing with Vietnam, and also Thailand would also be competing with other countries that are trying to attract their firms to reshore. So that means that the limited number of foreign direct investment that is now becoming available is being tapped not only by the developing countries that used to be the production hub for those firms, but they are also being challenged by the industrial policy of advanced economy trying to make their firm reshore. So that is one strategy that would not be always easy. And the second strategy that you can see is that to try to benefit more from being the regional value chain, to try to tap into the opportunity that opens up in the region as well. And that what does that mean for countries like Thailand is that we can no longer just be involved as the production hub, but we also have to try to become more, get closer to the consumer and try to attract the growing middle income population that is opening up in the region. And for that, perhaps Southeast Asia is still in the good position that a lot of market potentials and the growth engine is still in that area in Southeast Asia. So we are seeing a lot of Thai firms now using outward direct investment to kind of to tap into opening and then secure market access to other countries within the region. And I think a third strategy would be, again, to diversify our engagement with different countries, which means that we don't want to just become the one. For example, Vietnam is very much dependent on foreign direct investment from Korea, but I think Thailand needs to balance its attractiveness to different countries, EU as well as the US as well as other countries. And I think that leads to the fourth question of the challenge of doing those strategies. What would be the kind of the policy or the kind of the strategy that we need to be concerned with? And I think first, we need to, first of all, we have to make ourselves important and make ourselves relevant by trying to improve and upgrade the level of being the kind of the producer and what we can offer to different companies. And what does that mean? It means that we have to think a lot about the kind of the upgrading of manufacturing activities, automation, technology, servicification of manufacturing, compliance to green standard and compliance to different kind of standards that would improve the whole value chain in the eyes of the lead firms who are looking more for supply chain transparency and then supply chain traceability. So that sort of things need to be taken into consideration of the industrial policy for countries like Thailand. And then the next challenge would be, then there are so many standards, European standard, and then different standards. And complying to these standards comes with cost. So the only companies that perhaps could conform to the most sophisticated compliant cost to green transition and energy transition would be the largest firm in the country, and smaller and medium enterprise who used to be supplier to other companies might not all be able to comply to those things. So we might be seeing more consolidation domestically as well, which would lead to large firms in the countries that would take more beneficial and advantageous position. And then also we need to think about how we comply to different standards at the same time. And that would risk to different kind of producer might having to choose that, okay, perhaps China might not be as serious on their standards, although China is also now trying to make their investment more green and more environmental friendly, but that remains to be seen whether they adopt the same kind of standard. So it is that kind of challenge of having to comply to standards that are imposed on by players from the upstream and the downstream end of the global value chain. That would be the challenge for countries like Thailand. And I think another point that I would like to mention is how do we compete with different countries in the region? And to compete with different countries, I guess we have to look at how different countries offer the kind of the package, and not just the package for investment, but how we can kind of make our industrial policy try to strengthen the position that we are already there. Thailand, for example, is trying to use the EV, the electrical vehicle, to become one area where we become an important supplier in this industry. So the policy that needs to link between the firms upgrading and the industrial policy to attract investors to this industry and to make the country ready for that kind of different industry for different players. And I think those are my key points, you know, for being the countries that are at the receiving end. The challenge of economic security is not really choosing side, but choosing how to survive in this kind of the world that the major superpowers are becoming less and less friendly toward each other. And I think I stop there.
Yeah, well, thank you, Pavida, for highlighting the divergence of interest between some countries in East Asia and most of the countries in Southeast Asia. So at some point there may be convergence, you know, through diversification. Well, Southeast Asia is benefiting from the diversification. But at some other points, well, there are diverging views. And so it is very tricky for Southeast Asian countries to carve out a niche for themselves. So that's really not easy. And I'm afraid that there is actually very little room for maneuver for Southeast Asian countries. And there may be, to some extent, a lack of agency on their part. But I hope that I'm too pessimistic, and it's less negative than that. Any reactions to what Pavida said on the part of the other speakers? No reactions? No? Professor Suzuki, nothing to add to what Pavida said?
Well, of course, Pavida has made a very comprehensive analysis on the reaction of the Southeast Asian countries, but I would say there are some room for the Southeast Asian countries to make the superpower compete and to attract more investment. I think there are certain ways and strategies for the Southeast Asian countries to, you know, it's an open-ended question. I mean, it's you know, you are not taking any sides, which means that you are open to any other bets. And then there are certain competition. So, for example, there are a number of you know, the investment in the infrastructure in Southeast Asian countries. There were high-speed railway in Indonesia, and that eventually won by the Chinese company. But I think Japan is trying to compete in the of course the price competition. China is in advantage, but Japan is trying to provide with technology and the high quality. So that sort of thing is actually benefiting the Southeast Asian countries, and I think it's not that, you know, they do have some room to. Well, I think there are some rooms and the strategies for the Southeast Asian countries to maneuver.
I think I totally agree to your point, and I think it goes to the point of how we make ourselves upgrade the domestic scenario to become more relevant. And that includes, of course, you know, infrastructural improvement, as well as upgrading the skills of the suppliers to make sure that we offer the kind of the suppliers that is needed in this kind of the new supply chain that is becoming more automated and value added. Yes.
Well, the tricky part, though, is not to be too dependent at the end of the day, to put yourself in the hands of a partner, and then you will be heavily dependent. And at the end of the day, you will not have any, well, economic security, if we go back to the initial question. So that's a tricky bit. I agree that there is a possibility of, you know, well, playing one against the other and trying to attract, and so you make the best of it. but not avoid being overly dependent, and that's the tricky part. Well, I have one question before I open the floor to the audience. I have one question about innovation and technology. My point is that isn't it a way of ensuring economic security? You emphasize diversification. Everybody's been talking about that. Okay, what about trying to be more self-sufficient in a way? And you mentioned the case of Japan exerting pressure on Korea by depriving Korea of absolutely key elements for the production of semiconductors. And as far as I know, there have been attempts, not necessarily successful, but there have been attempts by Korean companies to develop their own capabilities. So do you think this is a way out to enhance economic security, to push or enhance innovation, or that's too complicated, let's forget it?
Yeah, again, the Korean government does not promote the technology and innovation policy, rather tries to promote the technology and innovation policy in combination with other policies as well. That was my point in the previous remark. And then, for example, in the aftermath of the Japanese government decision to drop South Korea from its whitelist, actually, South Korean government tried to reduce dependence on Japan in the areas of parts and materials. And then actually against that backdrop, South Korean government also realized that it is not going to be very easy to deal with that kind of challenges in a post-hoc measures. Rather, it's going to be more useful and effective to come up with more proactive measures or preemptive measures. That's one of the reasons why South Korean government designated the 100 essential strategic items in the areas of materials, parts, and equipment. And then in order to materialize that kind of policy initiative, the Korean government embarked on the structural vulnerability test, actually, and found out that actually South Korea is highly vulnerable and dependent on import for over more than 5,000 items. And then out of 5,000, actually South Korea is dependent on 3,000 items on China. So they'll try to reduce that kind of vulnerability by promoting the innovation capability in Korea, in the domestic arena. And at the same time, again, Korean government tried to enhance its own technological and innovative capability by seeking international cooperation. And particularly here, the backbone of the South Korea's international cooperation security in the areas of technology and innovation policy is with the United States, right? Actually, as is well known, last May bilateral summit between South Korea and the United States governments, actually both governments agreed to the strategic economy and technology partnership. Right, and they agreed to enhance and strengthen cooperation and collaboration, particularly in the areas of emerging technology issue areas. And then the South Korean government's policy priority was how to tap into the U.S. innovation system. For example, in the last bilateral summit, Korean government and U.S. government agreed to actually, U.S. government agreed to allow South Korean companies such as Samsung and SK Hynix to join the NSTC, National Semiconductor Technology Center of the United States, where South Korean companies will be eligible for the U.S. government subsidies to invent and develop the high-end chip technologies. So that is one example where South Korean government making a lot of efforts to tap into the U.S. innovation system. So on the one hand, current, obviously, increasing or enhancing tech sovereignty is a policy option in the domestic arena. On the other hand, seeking cooperation with the United States and other West countries would be another alternative. The thing is that how to combine those two policies is going to be the daunting challenges in the coming things in the South Korean government.
Thank you. Anything you want to add? Yes, please.
Yes, I would just add one more point is Taiwan produce most of the chips in the world. However, we noticed that the strategic competition has moved from chips towards critical minerals or natural resources. So right now we have the chip nationalism, and now we have this resources nationalism. And Taiwan, though we are largest chip maker, but we do not have any natural resources. And while the whole world is talking about networking of critical minerals, including rare earth, and also including everything that is needed for chip making, as well as for batteries for electronic vehicles, in Taiwan actually is vulnerable in this aspect. So in Taiwan, we've been calling for further collaboration with like-minded companies or like-minded democracy, so that we can work together work together to either explore or development or invest in these critical minerals that are very much important for all critical technology, and to avoid all these risks and also direct implications of, for example, China weaponize its critical mineral, including a rare earth and other things. So I think that is something that we have to pay more attention. It's not only about chip making. Even if you can make chips by yourself, but if you do not have access to secure access to all these raw materials, including the gas, including all these minerals, including equipment and technology, it's still just having a fabrication will not serve your national security purpose. Thank you.
Sure, well, that's the whole problem of the semiconductor industry. I mean, the production line is so long, and there is nobody controlling the whole thing. So you can block it at any point of the chain, and that makes it, well, particularly interesting, but particularly vulnerable too, and particularly tricky. Okay, well, and now I guess I'll open to the floor. So raise your hands, introduce yourself, and ask your questions in this order. All right, so you were the first, I guess, to raise your hand. Yeah, there is a mic.
Thank you. My name is Yan-Mei Xie with Gabacal Dragonomics. So thanks for every speaker for a very informative discussion. But I want to invite everyone to perhaps share some of the, if there exist, financial and monetary incentives that each government offers to company to, perhaps shape their decisions and behavior. Are there, for example, favorable loans, grants that incentivize companies to diversify from risky countries or areas, and also encourage them to invest in preferred countries, invest in preferred sectors? Thank you.
We'll get a couple of questions, and then we'll get back to the speakers. So Mathilde, the first floor.
Thank you very much for this very informative discussion. I'm Mathilde Villiers from Ifri, a research fellow in the Geopolitics of Technology program. And so my question builds on what Dr. Lee was saying, because considering this history of diplomatic tensions and attempts at economic coercion between Japan and South Korea, I was wondering what your thoughts were on the partnerships between Japan, South Korea, and the US, because we have seen that the US is trying to bring closer together these two countries, especially on questions of economic security and technology. But considering the tensions, the economic coercion, and the fact that they're tech competitors at the end of the day, I was wondering how efficient and stable you thought that this kind of partnership could be. Thank you.
So one common theme we had on this panel was that there's sometimes a mismatch between what governments want and what firms actually do. I just want to add to that sometimes there are also unintended consequences from the kind of government incentives that are set to diversify risk. For example, a recent World Bank study by Michele Ruta and Aditya Matu shows that while the US in relative terms in the last couple of years has decreased its trade and investment dependence on China and increased it with Southeast Asia, That at the same time means that value chains within Asia actually have strengthened and the relative centrality of China has increased in these value chains. So I would just be interested what the panel would make of this apparent paradox.
Let's get back to the speakers first, and then there will be a second round of questions. So who wants to jump in on Japan, Korea, US, on the paradox that was highlighted, mismatch, firms and governments' interests, the financial aspect? So.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I will address NICOLAS' question regarding the supply chains. So I had a paper, working paper that was just a completed look at the China's role in global supply chains and also the implication of the U.S.-China trade war and the Ukraine war. And what I found is that indeed, like you mentioned, NICOLAS, despite the effort by the U.S. to disentangle itself with China's presence in Southeast Asia region, which is becoming increasingly important for U.S. as a source of supply, has increased. And this is mainly due to, I think, two reasons. The first one is because many Chinese firms themselves are establishing presence in Southeast Asia. And that is partly a response to the US-China trade war when they found out that they have to pay a 25% additional tariff because of the trade war when they export directly from China to the US. So many of them decided to shift the production to countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, and so on. And also they can take advantage, for example, of the various free trade agreements that these countries like Singapore has with the US. So that is one reason. Another reason is because if you look at East and Southeast Asia in general, I mean, even before the trade war, they are the region with one of the most deeply, connected intra-regional trade in the world. I mean, of course, the one with the deepest integration would be Europe because of the EU. But other than the EU, another region that with a very high level of intra-industry trade is East and Southeast Asia. And that is dictated by the nature of the type of trade activities you see in the region, because in East and Southeast Asia, you have a lot of electronics and especially computers trade. And for this type of products, one country cannot manufacture everything. Instead, you would have a lot of intra-industry trade, parts, components being shipped from one country to the other, and then the next, and back and forth, between, for example, Korea, which produce, the memory, Taiwan, which produce the chips, and Vietnam, which produce the keyboard, and so on. So, of course, you will see a lot of intra-industry trade. And despite the effort by the U.S. in the TPP negotiations to kind of cut off China from the supply chain, if you look at the TPP negotiation, one very interesting new mechanism that the U.S. included in the TPP, for example, for the textile and clothing sector, is this so-called yarn forwarding rule, which basically stipulates that, if Vietnam, let's say, want to export the textiles products to the U.S., then the yarn that is used for these textile and clothing products must be sourced from within the TPP region. Essentially, that means that China would be kept out because China is not part of the TPP. But actually, before the TPP was negotiated, a lot of the fabric that the Vietnam firms are getting are from China because they do not have the manufacturing capacity, especially for the high level of fabrics. So they have to source from China. But because of this provision in the TPP, which is kept in the CPTPP, they have to try to source away from China. And that explains why even many textile firms from China are trying to relocate in the region. So I guess, what you are dealing with, supply chain is very complicated. And you inevitably will see all these unintended consequences, because at the end of the day, all these export control restrictions and so on takes place at the national level, while real trade activities are conducted at the firm level. And for the firms, actually, they do not have a homeland, right? They can decide to relocate anywhere they want, so the capital can always move, especially for the less sensitive items. I mean, of course, if you are talking about semiconductor manufacturing or lithography, because that is so sensitive, so you might not be able to shift around. But for most other products, textiles, electronics, I think it is relatively easy for the firms to shift around. So that explains why we are seeing that.
Anybody else on that? I see that Pavida is raising her hand, and Dr. Suzuki as well. So Pavida first, ladies first.
Thank you. I think the issue on firms' interests versus national interests is actually an important one, because when we are talking about security interests, we tend to take the perspective of the country level. And we tend to forget that the economic resilience, or you might call it supply chain resilience, also involves other players and other actors. Very important is, as we already discussed, is the firm level resilience, which means the operational efficiencies of the companies that are involved in that particular industry or that particular supply chain. And I think that's why the discussion on the technology that can upgrade the company's operation becomes more important. And that highlights the significance of issue like traceability of supply chain, and then all those issues that I discussed earlier. But also the second level of resilience that we also need to take into consideration is the global value chain resilience at the industry level, how industry are organized. And as you can see that we are talking about EV, but if we are look at the EV supply chain, you can see that now the shift in the supply chain is becoming more important towards the activities of batteries and everything. And I think Japanese car companies are now looking at their suppliers in the Southeast Asia that used to be more the center for assembly and for parts that are not totally dependent on the natural resource. And that needs to be taken into consideration. So I think I agree with the question, the last question, and I would like to highlight that when we look at security, we should not just overlook the level of other stakeholders in the supply chain and in the whole theme of security. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Suzuki, you want to jump in?
Right. Yeah, just for the responding to the last question, I think the problem of this mismatch and unintended consequences is directing towards the question of, or the economic security policy of the United States. And I think what United States does and what other European and the Japanese or East Asian countries does is completely different. The United States is trying to detach the China and try to exclude China from many fronts, but I think that's not what we are trying to achieve, and I think that's not our intention. So that's not eventually not unintended consequences, because we are not intended. So I think don't mix up with what United States says, because the United States economic security policy is quite unique, and they are basically thinking of the economic security as a security policy, not an economic policy. So they are not trying. I mean, they are just simply victimize all the the Japanese and the rest of the world, and for the sake of cutting off China from the supply chain and try to reduce the dependence. And what is also interesting to see is that the United States is more concerned about the Chinese economic coercion on the third country, not the United States itself, because for if you look at all the the list of what China has done, they are targeting the American allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Norway, Lithuania, etc. But they are not targeting the United States itself. So the U.S. economic security is directing towards the the allies of the United States rather than the United States itself. So I think this is another point that I just want to highlight in order to understand that what United States does is quite different from what we are doing, and don't mix it up. Okay, I'll stop there.
Well, thank you for this clarification, which I think is extremely important indeed. I mean, I guess that everybody understood that, but it's important to really stress that. So who first? Ladies first?
Okay, lady first.
Ladies first again.
Thank you very much for this. I will respond to two questions. In Taiwan's experiences, the government's policy always have carrots and sticks. And in many cases, sticks work better than carrots. For example, you can have a lot of incentives, but if you just put one or two sticks, and that will change the investment strategy or business strategy. For example, Taiwanese company have been so much in comfort zone in investing in China, but it was not until the U.S. imposed 301 tariffs, and also because their customer asked them to relocate. Then they start to relocate, and then they start this relocation or expansion into Southeast Asia. So there's a lot of, there's actually a combination of carrots and sticks, and also the domestic or the host government's policy together with foreign governments' policy together. So that means that you need to have collaboration among different governments. The second thing is about this Southeast Asia increasing trade and supply chain partnership, a lot of them targeting the U.S. market. Yes, it has been, this is from our experiences investigating into hundreds of Taiwanese investors in Southeast Asia. Yes, they have shifted to Southeast Asia, either build their own new factories or expand their factory to take care of the new business shifting from China. However, still the current common obstacle is the more they invest, the more they export, the more they need to import the these intermediate goods, components, and semi-finished materials from China. And this is not only for the ICT sectors. This also relates to the garment and textile sector. For example, Vietnam, they export a lot of garments to U.S. market. However, it has at least 35 to 40% of materials they need to import from China. So this government have to work a lot to not only to attract the so-called downstream investment, which covers only assembly, they also to move upwards to invite and to develop intermediate as well as the middle the middle level of the supply chain. And for doing that, I think it's just providing incentive will never be enough. So you need to have a complete industrial policy. You need to have a very friendly investment environment. And first of all, you also need to upskill your labor, because right now we heard a lot of complaints for Taiwanese company investing in Southeast Asian. They may have enough workforce, but there is huge shortage of skilled labor. For example, for Vietnam itself, Vietnam probably the most important beneficiary because of this relocation. But according to Vietnam's own estimate, they need at least to train 200,000 software engineer in terms of develop their own industry. So I think it's more about upgrading of their supply chain, and also about upgrading their labor force. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Dr. Lee, you want to have a go at the Japan,
Yeah.
US, Korea?
Yeah, actually, yeah, I'll try to be brief in the interest of time. Several issues I would like to address. First one is that the incentives to private companies in Korea. Actually, this time in Korea, the industrial policy is basically defensive measures, particularly to respond to the proliferation of industrial policy in other parts of the world, such as the US Chips and Science Act and the EU Chips Act. Actually, so in that regard, I would say it's still defensive measures. So then by that, I mean that the Korean government tries to be less interventionist in promoting the semiconductor industry in Korea. Of course, South Korea has a very long legacy as well as tradition in terms of industrial policy, and I think we know how to execute industrial policy, but this time less interventionist. That is one of my point. And in terms of the form of industrial policy is quite different from other countries. First, actually last May, Korean government enacted the so-called K-Chips Act. Actually, in here, actually the government policy support actually largely takes the form of tax credits rather than direct subsidies. It's a clear-cut contrast to other countries' industrial policy, particularly semiconductor industrial policy. And the second is that actually deregulation in the domestic arena. Actually, as I indicated in my first remark, actually Korean government announced its plan to create the world's largest semiconductor cluster in Yongin area. It's a suburb of Seoul. Actually, until recently, actually, big corporations, chaebols, investment in Seoul metropolitan area was heavily regulated by the government. Now, Korean government this time decided to relax its regulation to allow the big corporation to invest in these areas. So the Korean government actually expects the private companies such as Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix to invest in this area as much as $250 billion. So that's going to be a huge amount of investment. Second is that on Korea-Japan relations, of course, the Korea-US bilateral summit was a kind of the pivotal moment in revitalizing the South Korea's cooperation with Japan. But at the same time, on both sides of, both Korea and Japan, it is a bit risky to strengthen or resume the bilateral cooperation in a very rapid way. So in that regard, both countries tend to implicitly agree to strengthen the bilateral cooperation in the framework of the trilateral cooperation. That has to do with the Korea, US, Japan trilateral cooperation framework. And in that trilateral framework, actually, there was a meaningful agreement in terms of the provision of the public goods in the supply chain resilience. Actually, the three countries agreed to launch the pilot project in creating the supply chain stability and resilience programs. So that was a kind of the very important and meaningful cooperation. And the third one is that how to incorporate corporate interest into the economic security strategy is a very challenging issue, not just in Korea, but also in other countries as well. In this regard, I would say Korean government's role has been more a kind of the facilitator rather than a leader in this area. So if we look at the example of the 5G network equipment deployment, actually Korean government allowed LG U+, so the third largest telecom service provider in Korea, to deploy the Huawei equipment. Actually, in that regard, South Korean government does not force the private companies to securitize the economic decision-making at the company level. Rather, South Korean government tries to warn the hidden risk of the deploying the Huawei network equipment. That is one of the very good case in point. And also that's one of the reasons why in Korea, there are some underdeveloped areas of economic security strategy. Because South Korea has been very cautious in hurting or damaging the corporate interest. For example, in South Korea's economic security strategy, export control is underdeveloped. and the investment screening is also underdeveloped. Believing that that may hurt the corporate interest if we overly securitizing that kind of policies, then may have the negative impact on the South Korean companies' corporate interests. So in that regard, South Korean government tries to be less interventionist and impose the less binding policy measures. Let me stop here.
Thank you. Well, I'm afraid we are running out of time. Oops. Sorry. I'm afraid we're running out of time, so we have to put this discussion to an end. That's too bad. That was extremely interesting. So join me in thanking our panelists for this very interesting discussion, both the online panelists as well as the real one, the in-person ones. So thank you all. Thank you for the very interesting discussion.